The Edify Show with special guests, best-selling author Janette Oke. And now, the host of The Edify Show, Elliott.
Hi everyone, welcome to Hearty TV Tuesday on The Edify Show. You know, I feel like calling this one the Founding Mother Edition. Today I've got an interview with Janette Oke, and for those that don't really know who she is, she's so much more than the author that inspired the TV show Wind Calls the Heart. I mean, even some of you that are fans might be shocked to know that that sweet, shy, unassuming woman of faith, she single-handedly almost changed Christian fiction forever. She almost invented Christian fiction, or she certainly reinvented it. And what I'm going to show you just might blow your mind about the founder of Wind Calls the Heart. Now, we shot this footage years ago because I felt like the story was so important. I just had to capture it. This is a short biography of Janette Oke, but it all began when I asked her to tell me her story in her own words. And knowing where we end up today, it's just incredible. Let's take a look.
My mother and father were Canadian farmers, and before I was born, things were pretty tough on the prairies. It was the dry, windy, dusty, dirty 30s. And my mother had already had 4 children, and then she lost a baby boy. It was a very sad time for her, but it was a good time for me. I hadn't arrived yet, but because of her grief, she went up into the loft of the farm barn and threw herself down in the hay and cried out, "Oh God, if you're really there, do something for me." And God did. So when I arrived, a couple of years later, I had a Christian mother. She was very young in her faith, but really seeking God's direction for her life. It wasn't long after that my folks moved away from the prairie, further north in Alberta, to find a place where it still knew how to rain, and my father became a farmer there. So I was born into a Christian family, and we had a local little church that we attended. I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't interested in storytelling. My mom and dad were both readers, and they used to read to us a lot, and it gave me a real love for stories. So before I could even write words on paper, I used to walk around the farm telling stories orally. I tried to convince my younger sister that they were real stories, and she never did believe me. But it was a way to express myself and to discover some creativity. I went to a little one-room country school, and our teacher there was very encouraging of anything creative. And I remember she used to put pictures up on the ledge of the blackboard and allow us to write a story concerning it. And many of these were Norman Rockwell paintings. So it was very easy to see what had just happened and to imagine what might happen next. And I enjoyed that very much. So I always had this love for writing. During my teen years, I wrote for self-expression, just to sort of explore, I think, who I were, my inner feelings. And as I grew older, the things that I wrote were either something that I really cared about or else a means of self-expression. I was married right after attending Bible college. My husband went into the ministry, and so we were very, very busy. And then we had 4 children. But I still had that inner desire to write, and I felt that before I really attempted that, I needed some training, because I felt as a Christian, everything we do should be done to the very best. But that training didn't come for me. I was too busy, and there were never funds to explore it. And so finally, I was actually 42 years old before I attempted my first novel. And I did a lot of praying about it because I knew I was going to need help, a lot of help. I lived with Clark and Marty from the series Love Comes Softly for many months mentally before I began to write. And so I felt that I knew them very well. And then in quite a short period of time, I got the words down on paper. And I told God, God, if this works, and if I find out I really do have talent, then I'm going to give it all to you. And I thought God would be really excited about that. Well, it was just as though he spoke to me and said, now just a minute, we've got this all backward. I'm not concerned about your talent. I don't want things after you're done with them. If you really mean what you are saying, I want it all right now before you even start. And I was surprised that I had to do a lot of praying about that. I thought that as a Christian, I had given every part of my life to my Lord. And suddenly I realized that I was hanging on to that. I think I felt that writing would help me discover who I really was. So I had to do some praying and say, okay, God, we'll do it your way. I give it all to you right now. And whether something exciting happens or absolutely nothing at all, it's up to you. And so I've always been so thankful that God sort of backed me into a corner and we had that issue all settled before I started. So when I had finished my book, I sent it back to my grade school teacher who went through it, and she watched for grammar and all of those things that an author must be very conscious of. And then I put it up on a shelf for about a year. I had absolutely no idea how one handled the manuscript, what you did with it. And so my husband brought me home some library books where I did some research and found out that you never send out a cold manuscript, you send out query letters. So I wrote a few of those and mailed them off to some publishing houses. I had no idea who would be interested in that type of work, because at that point, the Christian community wasn't really publishing fiction. But I went through the library and looked through some of the books on the shelf and decided, well, maybe this company is doing this type of work and whatnot, and picked out some possibilities, sent out the query letters, and one of them went to Bethany House Publishers. When it seemed like it took weeks for the answer to come back, but when the letter did finally arrive, it was signed by Carol Johnson. And I was so excited to see that it was a woman that was replying to me, because I thought I had written for women. If there was anyone that was going to understand what I was trying to say, it would be another woman.
I had just been appointed editorial director at Bethany House Publishers, and my predecessor was a man. And when her query letter came to my desk, and she had attached several sample chapters with it, I read those and was immediately captivated. There was something about the way Janette told the story. It was simple but not simplistic, and it was powerful, and it connected with me emotionally in a way it's difficult to describe. But I wrote to her right away and asked her if she could send the complete manuscript.
And so here we were with a manuscript that Carol looked at, and she thought was pretty good. She sent it to a few other readers within that little company, and some thought it was good, and some thought, well, maybe it needs to work. Too much dialect, from the 1800s in there. So anyway, after getting a number of comments from within the publishing house, Carol was really a believer, strong believer in this. So she came to our one of our weekly editorial meetings where we decide to publish or not to publish, and she made a pitch for this.
At that time, it was 5 men and me. And we sat in a circle at a table, and I stared into the faces of these 5 men who were polite, but probably skeptical.
Carol Johnson had to work very hard to convince the men that this was an option. They didn't see this fiction as being really a workable work to be published at that point in time. They were publishing a lot of good self-help books and other materials, but fiction was not in their line.
I tried not to be too enthusiastic. That overselling doesn't work with a lot of men, including my husband, who was my boss. And so they listened, and we talked it through. The consensus was that CBA fiction for the Christian market was really small, a few inches in a back shelf in a retailer's store.
I was a fiction reader, but I wasn't finding on the secular shelves material that matched my worldview. And I thought there must be a lot of other young women out there with the same difficulty. So I really felt that there was a gap that we as a Christian community should be supplying to give readers an option. And it turned out that that was so.
And we felt that there was time for something different, something new. And even though Janette didn't have a platform, as we talk about today, we felt that her story had power and was worth pursuing. So we sent her a contract.
It was interesting to me because I had sent that query out and waited week after week after week for the reply. It seems like that time drags on for an author. And finally, the day that a letter came back from Bethany House, which it was at that point, I picked up the mail and I didn't even remember what they would be writing me for. And so I carried the letter home, and I was so glad that I hadn't opened it at the post office, because when I saw their reply, I was in tears. And they said they would publish the manuscript, and I have been with Bethany House ever since. So that has been a great blessing for me.
We published the first book, Love Comes Softly, and rather timidly, in one respect, we printed 5,000 copies, which in that day wasn't real timid, but it was quite timid, okay? It indicated that we didn't know this was going to be a big seller.
The book was launched at the 1979 Christian Booksellers Convention, and we had it in a floor display, which you'll see still in retailers' outlets. And we had 45 copies in this floor display, which was a sample for retailers to see what they could do with this new fiction. Often books are given away at the Booksellers Convention, and copies started disappearing off that display until we finally had only one copy left, and we had to shrink wrap it in place so that it wouldn't disappear too. We think the connection with the cover, the design, the title, it all just suggested this is a book I would enjoy. And so women were taking copies with them as they walked by. So we thought at that time, this is going to be good. We possibly have a winner here.
The Christian bookstores were somewhat reluctant to put this book on their shelves because, again, of the lack of enthusiasm for the concept of Christian fiction. They did, but lightly. The thing that gave the book the best boost in the beginning was an organization called Successful Living that had home parties, and then they also put racks into general market areas, to the drugstores and this sort of thing. Well, in the home parties, it really was a major factor because somebody would stand up in front of a group of maybe a dozen people in their home and hold this book up, Love Comes Softly by Janette Oke, and tell what it meant to them. And so you've got this personal recommendation, word of mouth, but you got it on a multiple basis, not one person talking to one person, but one person talking to maybe a dozen people. And this was happening in homes around the country. So that gave it a real good boost. And then finally the stores came to believe, that this was something that was here to stay and was going to work.
Within months, we were selling a significant quantity, not huge, but enough to say we probably should talk with Janette about another book.
After Love Comes Softly was published, I had another story in mind that I was preparing to work on next. And then the readership began sending in requests where what happens next to these people. I had thought it would be a one-book deal.
So Gary and I, my husband, and I went up to see her in Calgary. Actually, it was a little town called Didsbury, north of Calgary, and sat down with her, got to know her somewhat. She's retiring. She's a bit shy, but we had a great time with her and talked to her about doing a second book. We were receiving letters from readers who wanted to know what happened to Clark and Marty, and she was also receiving those.
And so Carol suggested that maybe we do another book to follow this, and it turned out to be an 8-book series, and they were still wondering what was going to happen next. It was interesting because I would get letters from some people would say, well, you know, there's still some things that could happen to this family. So what happens next? And others would write and say, oh, please, please don't do any more because Clark and Marty are getting so old. One of them is going to die, and we couldn't stand that. So it was interesting, the response from readership.
The next year, when we came to the market with the sequel to Love Comes Softly, we had a nice big number to tell the retailers about, that this was important and it was going to be an important part of their sales strategy. So that was the beginning. That was the start.
We began then initially doing one book a year from her. And she liked to just commit to one book at a time because she wasn't sure that she was going to have another idea for another book that was going to be, you know, good to publish. And that's not the usual way of doing things at all. Authors generally want this stuff, you know, packaged in a nice big chunk and get rolling. But she wanted it one at a time, and that was okay with us. We loved Janette. We love her now, of course. But we appreciated the way that she wanted to do it.
She would say, I'm not sure I'm going to have more stories to tell. So she would ask us to just send a contract when she had a story idea that we liked. So sometimes early in the spring, she would pick up the phone and call me and describe a story that she had in mind. And always they sounded delightful, and we would send her a contract. So one at a time. She has a file full of contracts, and over the years, about 50 adult novels written for adults, but often read by children as young as 8 or 10, and grandmothers as old as 80. But then she also wrote a dozen children's stories, and we published those eventually with her also.
So we did one a year for a few years, and then she got to the point where she would want to do 2 books a year. So she did 2 books a year for maybe 20 years. And we knew that in the first 6 months of any new book of hers, we'd sell 250,000 copies out there. Through the Christian bookstores, through the general market stores, through Successful Living, you know, these racks and the home parties. And it was just like clockwork.
I have never had to be concerned about sales or any of the aspects of writing. I've left it all in his hands. And it has been exciting to see what he has decided to do with it.
She has a family of 4 children, and they were early teens and teens by that time, but still require mothering, which she never wanted to walk away from in any way. So she was a busy mother and wife and pastor's wife, so she had duties in the church also, which were important to her.
When Love Comes Softly was first published, I was still working full-time, and we had 4 teenagers in our house, so it was a busy place. I was always very thankful that I hadn't begun my writing when the children were very small, because I had no idea how busy it would keep me. For one thing I didn't know was that once your name appears on a book, people assume you are a speaker as well. So you begin to get all of these speaking engagements lined up. And my thought at first was, well, this is another chance to share my faith with people. So I felt obligated to take these speaking engagements. But after several years of that, I realized that it was too much. I was doing 3 books a year, 2 for adults and 1 for children. And so my time was very, very full, and there were a lot of speaking engagements that came my way, and people would say, we'll take you anytime. Surely you must have an evening or an afternoon or something available. And so it became very pressure-packed. So I decided that really God had called me to write rather than to speak. And so I went with the writing.
Very soon, each novel that Janette wrote and we released for the marketplace began appearing on the bestseller lists. These are lists that the industry, both the general market and the Christian market, produces monthly. And for 25 years, there was at least one Janette Oak book on every bestseller list.
One thing that I was very appreciative about Bethany House Publishers was that they were very protective of the content of my books. And even though at one point there was a movie industry that was interested in filming Love Comes Softly, and they were given opportunity, actually, I did a lot of praying about it because I wasn't sure how they would handle the content, if they would really understand the message that I was trying to present. And eventually it did fizzle out. And then along came Michael Landon. Well, I, of course, knew Michael Landon Sr.'s work, and I felt very relieved when I found out that Michael Landon Jr. was interested in doing the books.
About 15 years ago, I got a call from Michael Landon Jr., and he had been given a copy of Love Comes Softly. I don't remember who gave it to him or why, but he was very captivated by that story, particularly the character of Clark. He said to me, "Clark is the kind of husband and father I want to be." And he said, "I would really like to make a movie of this story." So began the long haul of getting the right pieces in place and the right money and so forth. Eventually, it landed with Hallmark. And from my perspective, that seemed like a marriage made in heaven.
One day I got a surprise phone call. This is Michael Landon. Now, I knew that by my contract with Bethany House, they had all of the rights to anything that could be done with the material in my books. So he had no obligation to call me. But he did, out of courtesy, and I appreciated that very much. Michael has felt the heart of those people and has been able to share some of their faith with the viewers, and that was so important to me. So I have been thrilled to be able to have a small part of that.
It was just a fun thing, and it was a thrill for Janette Oak, too, not just to see it come out, be filmed in movie form and come out as a movie, but she was thrilled that Michael Landon was doing it, because here was a man who was not only skilled at making films, but who believed in the story, was thrilled with the story. And it was parallel to his beliefs, and he wanted to get it out so as many people could see it as possible.
I would say this about a film. My experience is that the best way to see a film that's based on a book you've read is to see them as parallel. And so if they intersect occasionally, that's fine. But to watch a film differently than you read the book, because there will be differences, and they are required both by the length of time you have to show a movie and other factors in terms of costs. So I think most of the viewership for Love Comes Softly, the one that Michael wrote and directed, has been very pleased with it.
The first time I viewed the movie, I was thrilled. For the one thing, you have to prepare yourself for your work being adapted into another media. And I had done that. So I told myself, now you're going to watch this as though it's a brand new story, not connected with your book at all. And so by doing that, I could really appreciate what Michael had done in the film. And he did retain a lot from what the book had presented. And to see the characters live and to watch them on the set, it was a real thrill for me, and I enjoyed it so much. Now, as they have worked their way through the 8 books, the story has gotten further and further away from the book stories. So I have had readers say to me, well, I've just finished book number 6, or just watched number 6 of the film, so which book do I read next? Well, they don't fit, they don't match anymore, so that doesn't carry over. But he still has retained that message that I hope to present as well, and it's been wonderful working with Michael. He's a true gentleman, and I just appreciate him so much.
I was privileged and honored that Janette Oke allowed me to adapt her novel, Love Comes Softly, into a film. And thankfully, her response was very positive, and I was very grateful for that. And so we have now ventured off into the next largest franchise that Janette has written, When Calls the Heart.
Janette Oak's Canadian background made it natural for her to think about a story related to Mounties. And so she began developing the idea of the Canadian West series. It would feature a young teacher in a rather wealthy family from Toronto, and she saw the West as a great adventure for her, and she would take her teaching skills out west. So that was the first story, When Calls the Heart. And that and the other books in that series have found another wide audience similar to Love Comes Softly.
People don't realize this is a woman who, in her quietness, has sold over 30 million copies of her books. There's only a handful of writers living today that can say that. And yet you would have no idea that this woman is that accomplished, and that many people love her for her work and her storytelling.
She has been the same Janette ever since we first met her. The core values that and characteristics for Janette have remained the same. And her numbers make her a star, but she doesn't act like a star. She's still the same loving, caring person, and loves her readership. She loves talking to women and men who have appreciated her books.
She is still the same person that she was 30 years ago. When a little over 30 years ago when we first met her. A humble mother, wife, up there in a small town in Canada. And the other thing that comes along with this too is she just never saw herself as a big star. She just saw herself as somebody who wanted to write something good for God. But she's still got the same values, the same love for God and family, and the same vision to see those books do something good out there.
And she's just a woman that is so down to earth and is so real.
People have often asked me, what I expected of being involved in writing. I had no expectations. I had left it entirely to him, and so it's been exciting to see what he has done. I refer to these books as my little paper missionaries because they have gone all around the world, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to share my faith with other people.
I remember the first time I met Janette, or maybe it was like shortly after, but this is my memory. I had a new baby, and I barely knew Janette, and I had to meet her in Nashville in this like gigantic convention center, like everything you had to walk a mile. The Gaylord, for those of you that know. But she's like carrying around, when I see her finally, she's carrying around a little stuffed animal that she brought with her, had been carrying around all the way from Canada for my son. I mean, she's just so sweet. She's like the sweetest, most grounded person you'll ever meet. And, and after this many years, I've known her so long now it's like I've just told her, I mean, she's like a grandmother to me. She knows it. But anyway, it meant a lot to me to have this interview with her on the set. I hope you guys enjoy it. So, Janette, I think I've known you now, I think it was about 2004, so about 20 years.
That's a long time.
That's a long time. Yeah, that's a long time. You should get a gold watch.
We're still speaking.
And we're still speaking. So it speaks a lot of Janette's patience. So I find it so interesting just talking to you a minute ago. You figure Wind Calls the Heart, you wrote that somewhere in the early 80s. And so here we are, 12 seasons in. So literally that first episode was somewhere around 30 years later. When you first wrote the book, did you even think about it becoming a TV show? Like, did that in any way enter your not even enter your imagination, or maybe a movie, or?
No, not really. I mean, I've always been a person that spent a lot of my time in reading.
Right.
And so I really didn't spend a lot of time going to movies and doing things. And so, it was the book.
I find it so interesting with what we're going to talk about here in a minute, but the idea of one of your books becoming a TV show, that began with a phone call for Love Comes Softly. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I was in my kitchen one day and the telephone rang and the person on the other end said, "Hello, I'm Michael Landon." And that was a shock. A real surprising, wonderful shock, but still a shock. And so we've been working together ever since, and it's been a good partnership.
And the thing I find so cool is, because what struck you was, of course, Little House.
Of course.
Right? Because Love Comes Softly would just be such a perfect tie-in for Little House in the Prairie. And
I think they're much similar shows that will appeal to pretty well the same audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, it really feels like the beauty of Wind Calls the Heart is it's that one show that a family can sit down and they can enjoy. And I think a lot of people think the last time they were able to really do that, and particularly with a frontier setting, had to be Little House in the Prairie. It really feels like a lot of Little House in the Prairie is commingling with Wind Calls the Heart. So here's just jumping right to it. So now we have just found out that Melissa Gilbert is actually appearing in Wind Calls the Heart.
And that's fabulous. And I think it's going to tie a whole bunch of people together once again.
Isn't that something? What did you think when you heard that?
First of all, surprise, and then excitement. I think it's going to be a very good thing.
Yeah, I agree. And so it's here we are 12 years in, and with no real end in sight, that people just seem to be just as excited about Wind Calls the Heart as ever. And the other thing I find is that it's going to draw that many more people to your books. Even a lot of the actors have read your books now.
That's exciting. Yes, I think there is a certain group of people that watched Little House that are now older, of course, because it's been out several years. But the ones that are now watching Wind Calls the Heart, because it's still a heart tugger,
Right.
It's going to pull the two groups together in a unique way.
So, as such a person of faith, and in my world, one of the strongest people of faith in my circle, how does it feel to see God use these books in such a way that just keeps getting and going and affecting so many people?
I think there's a large part of our community, both in Canada and the United States, that has been looking for something like that families can share and that is touching hearts. And I think that you, with your movies, have been filling that spot. And the whole family can watch it together, which is a beautiful thing. And for a few years, we didn't have that, Ray. So
No.
it's special.
No, it's almost like there's too much. You know, when I was young, you had basically the choice between maybe Lawrence Welk or Static, or I have to spend time with my family. Yeah, and then now, and here we are so you guys know, we're at the Hearties family reunion, you know, and so that's an area where it's kind of like Comic-Con for Wind Calls the Heart, where all of the fans will come together and just sort of celebrate the show and also really celebrate the relationship with each other. And Janette, you're like a fixture. You continue to come to the Hearties family reunion. Does it continue to touch you every year when you come in?
Absolutely. And this year, I think I've met more people from other countries than any other year. We've always had some that have come from Australia and Europe and whatnot. But this year, we seem to have several from some of the island countries that has been exciting to meet.
Isn't that great? And, you know, and of course, your books are published all over the world as well. You know, and so this is great. I have exciting news that I can announce to the world. But Janette, you're actually working on a completely other book.
I am. It will be very different, but it's been exciting as well.
Well, different is great if it's from you. I'm sure everybody, I know I'm personally very excited, you know, to see it, and then to see what you're being led to effect now. And then that's coming out in 2025, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Somewhere around Easter, they say.
And what's the title of it?
The Pharisee's Wife.
The Pharisee's Wife.
Pharisee's Wife.
The Pharisee's Wife, everybody. So then you can look for the book, and God willing, at some point, probably another TV series. Let's hope. Yeah, so a lot more coming from Janette Oke. Nothing stops you. It still keeps going and going. And we're so glad that you do, because clearly what you're doing bears fruit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a blessing that God has allowed me to communicate with people in this way. I love books myself, and it's so nice that there are still a lot of readers. Because, you know, we're kind of on the shelf now. Books are on the shelf, the TV's taken over, but it's nice to know there's still a good reading community out there, and now we get to watch it as well.
That's right. And books, you can still give them a good listen. And then now, thankfully, people see the value of her work, and they're going to watch. If you've never seen Wind Calls the Heart, and particularly if you're a fan of Janette Oke, then your favorite TV show you've ever not seen is waiting for you to watch it. Janette, thanks again so much for being on the program.
God bless everyone.
And that concludes this episode of the Edify Show. Thank you so much to my adopted grandmother, Janette Oke. And we'll see you guys next time right here on the Edify Show.
Tune in next week for a 3-interview edition of Hearties TV Tuesday. Elliott will be interviewing Loretta Walsh, Christian Cooper, and Billy Christos Jr. Don't forget to like and subscribe on our YouTube page. And never miss a thing when you register at Hearties.com, where people around the world are coming together to support inspiring entertainment. And we'll see you next week on The Edify Show.